The rain pounded against the windshield of Musa Kamara's vintage Peugeot, the rhythmic drumming almost drowning out the sound of his thoughts. The narrow streets of Accra, usually bustling with life, now lay abandoned under the weight of the downpour. The old colonial buildings, with their ivy-covered facades and intricate ironwork, seemed to melt into the shadows, creating a ghostly, silent world. His mind was a turbulent sea, much like the weather outside. Wealth, success, power, he had it all, yet there was a gaping emptiness, a void no amount of money or material success could fill. It was a hollow that echoed in the quiet moments, like now, when there was nothing but the storm and his own company. As Musa approached a red light, his foot eased onto the brake. The world outside his car was a blur of gray and black, the rain obscuring the details of the city he knew so well. His gaze drifted absent-mindedly to the side, where an alleyway cut through a row of buildings. At first he dismissed it as just another shadow in the night, another trick of the dim streetlights, but something made him look again. A small figure huddled against the wall, barely visible in the downpour. Musa squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was too small, too fragile to be an adult. His heart gave an involuntary lurch as he realized it was a girl no more than 8 or 9, soaked to the bone, and in her arms, she cradled something even smaller. Musa's instincts urged him to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen anything. It was easier that way. People like him didn't get involved in things like this, but something about the sight of that child shivering in the cold sparked a long-buried sense of responsibility, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He turned the car into the alley, the tires splashing through the puddles. The girl didn't move, her eyes wide with fear and desperation as the car approached. Musa parked a few feet away and got out, the rain immediately soaking through his expensive jacket. He walked slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hello," he called out, his voice softer than he expected. "Are you okay?" The girl tightened her grip on the bundle in her arms, now unmistakably a baby. Her eyes, filled with a mixture of terror and pleading, met his. Musa felt something inside him shift a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, kneeling to her level, the rain dripping from his hair into his eyes. "I just want to help. It's not safe out here." The girl hesitated, her gaze darting from him to the baby and then back to him. Finally, she nodded, a small, scared motion. Without fully understanding why, Musa reached out, gently taking the girl's hand and leading her to the car. As they climbed inside, Musa realized that this decision, was the beginning of something he couldn't quite name. But as he glanced at the children in the rearview mirror, he knew one thing: the emptiness that had haunted him for so long was beginning to fade. The drive back to Musa's home was silent, save for the soft patter of rain against the car's roof. The streets of Accra, drenched and empty, blurred past as Musa stole glances at the rearview mirror. The girl, now nestled in the back seat with her baby brother, held him close, her eyes wide and watchful. "I'm Musa," he said, breaking the silence, his voice gentle but steady. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, her grip tightening on the baby's blanket. "Amma," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "And this is Kojo." Musa nodded, repeating their names quietly to himself as if anchoring them in his mind. "It's nice to meet you, Amma. Don't worry, you're safe with me." Amma didn't respond, but her eyes, large and cautious, remained fixed on him, studying every movement. When they arrived at Musa's home, the sense of unease he had noticed in Amma on the drive only seemed to deepen. The house, a sprawling, well-furnished space filled with the remnants of a life built on success, suddenly felt cold, almost hostile. The walls, adorned with traditional art and expensive decor, did little to soften the sterile atmosphere. Musa could feel the distance between him and the children, a chasm of fear and mistrust. He led Amma and Kojo into the living room, trying to make the space feel less intimidating. "Let me get you both warmed up," he suggested, moving toward a closet where he kept extra blankets. "I'll grab some clothes for you too, something dry." Amma didn't move from where she stood, still clutching Kojo as if he might be taken from her at any moment. Musa paused, sensing her wariness. "It's okay," he reassured her. "I'm just getting some blankets. I'll be right here." He returned moments later, offering Ama a soft blanket and a pair of his old sweatshirts. "They might be a bit big, but they're warm," he said, trying to keep his tone light. Ama accepted the clothes without a word, her eyes never leaving his. Musa watched as she carefully wrapped Kojo in the blanket before slipping on the oversized sweatshirt herself. The image of this tiny girl swallowed by his clothing stirred something in him, an ache he hadn't felt in years. He realized, with a pang, that he had no idea how to care for children, especially ones who had been through what Ama clearly had. But the look in her eyes, that silent plea for safety, made him determined to try. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "We can find something to eat." Ama hesitated, then nodded slowly. Musa's heart lifted slightly. It was a small victory, but it was something. Mrs. Agyeman's cafe was a cozy refuge, the kind of place where the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of warm pastries, and the warmth of the fire chased away the chill from outside. But today, Musa could barely appreciate the inviting atmosphere. His thoughts were focused entirely on the little girl sitting across from him. Ama, bundled in one of his old sweaters, looked even smaller than she had the night before. Her eyes, large and watchful, seemed to take in everything with a mix of caution and curiosity. Kojo, now sleeping soundly in a stroller Mrs. Agyeman had kindly provided, was nestled close to his sister. Musa watched them both, his mind churning over the words Ama had shared with him earlier. Mamisa. She was the director. She didn't like us. She made us leave. The words echoed in Musa's mind, stirring a deep unease within him. There was something profoundly wrong about an orphanage that would turn children out onto the streets, especially one as young and vulnerable as Ama. Musa had tried to probe further, but Ama's answers had been vague, her voice faltering as she described the cold, the hunger, and the fear that had followed their departure. As he stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, Musa's thoughts turned to the orphanage itself, Baobab Children's Home. He had driven by it many times, a large, imposing building set back from the road, its windows barred, its walls high. It had always struck him as a somber place, but he had never given it much thought. Until now. The idea that such a place could harbor cruelty, that it could be a source of suffering rather than sanctuary, gnawed at him. He glanced at Ama again, noticing how she kept glancing around the cafe, her body still tense, her hands resting protectively on Kojo's stroller. Musa felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't known himself capable of. These children were now under his care, and the thought of them being mistreated filled him with a quiet, simmering anger. "What else can you tell me about Mamisa?" Musa asked gently, not wanting to push her too hard but needing to understand more. Ama hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. She didn't care about us," she said finally. "Sometimes she wouldn't give us enough to eat. It was always cold, and we had to sleep on the floor sometimes. If we made her angry." Musa's grip on his coffee cup tightened, the porcelain warm against his skin. He had seen enough in his life to recognize the signs of neglect, but hearing it from Ama, in her small, frightened voice, made it personal. He could feel the shift inside him, the part of him that had always stayed detached from other people's problems beginning to crumble. "I'm sorry," Ama, Musa said, his voice steady. "No one should have treated you and Kojo like that, but I want you to know that you're safe now. I'm going to make sure of it." Ama nodded, but her eyes were still guarded, the trust between them fragile and new. Musa knew that earning her trust fully would take time, but he was willing to wait. For now he had to focus on what he could do, starting with finding out more about Baobab Children's Home and this woman named Mamisa. Musa Kamara pushed open the heavy wooden doors of Accra City Hall, the smell of aged paper and musty air greeting him as he stepped inside. The building's grandeur, with its high ceilings and intricate moldings, was undermined by the oppressive quiet that hung in the air. This was a place where the past was preserved, not questioned, a place where secrets could easily be buried under layers of bureaucracy. He approached the front desk, where a clerk with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses peered over a stack of papers. The man's expression was one of thinly veiled impatience, as if Musa's presence was an interruption to the more important work of maintaining the status quo. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked, his tone making it clear he hoped the answer would be no. I'm looking for information on Baobab Children's Home, Musa replied, keeping his voice steady. He had anticipated resistance and was prepared to push past it. Specifically, records from the past decade. The clerk frowned, adjusting his glasses. Why would you need that? Musa chose his words carefully. I'm doing some research. For a personal matter, it's important. The clerk hesitated, eyeing Musa with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. That's not the kind of information we just hand out. You'd need a good reason, official paperwork at the very least. Musa leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to understand what's been going on at that orphanage. I think something isn't right, and if there's anything in those records that could help me, I'd appreciate your cooperation. There was a long pause as the clerk weighed Musa's words. Finally, he sighed, his resolve weakening. All right, he muttered, glancing around as if to ensure no one else was listening. I can let you take a look, but you didn't get this from me, understand? Musa nodded, grateful for the small victory. Understood. The clerk led him to a back room filled with rows of metal filing cabinets. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow on the dusty folders and forgotten records. The clerk pulled open one of the drawers and retrieved a stack of files, handing them to Musa with a resigned expression. Here's everything we have on Baobab Children's Home from the last 10 years. Good luck finding what you're looking for. Musa thanked him and sat down at a nearby table, the weight of the files heavy in his hands. He opened the first folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. The orphanage's early years were as he expected. Baobab had been founded by a woman named Aqua Nyarko, who had a reputation for her kindness and dedication to the children in her care. The records from those years were filled with commendations and praise from the community. But as Musa dug deeper, the tone of the records shifted. Aqua Nyarko had passed away unexpectedly 5 years ago, and almost immediately after her death, Mamisa Kohn had taken over as the orphanage's new director. The changes were subtle at first: financial reports showing unexplained expenses, legal documents with vague wording, and complaints from staff members that had been quietly dismissed. Musa's unease grew as he pieced together the pattern. Under Mamisa's leadership, Baobab had become less of a sanctuary for children and more of a business. Donations increased, but the funds were redirected into accounts that led nowhere. Several children had been transferred out of the orphanage without proper documentation, and there were no records of where they had gone. Hours passed as Musa sifted through the evidence, his determination hardening with every new discovery. It was clear that something sinister was happening at Baobab, and the complacency of the local officials had allowed it to continue unchecked. He finally closed the last folder, the full weight of what he'd uncovered settling on his shoulders. The sun had begun to set outside, casting long shadows through the windows of City Hall. Musa stood up, the urgency of his mission clear in his mind. As he left the building, the oppressive quiet seemed to follow him, but now it carried with it the dark secrets of Baobab. Musa knew that whatever was happening there had to be stopped, and he was the only one willing to do it. Musa's home, once a sanctuary of quiet and order, now felt more like a fortress under siege. The heavy curtains were drawn tight, shutting out the outside world, and the dim evening light cast long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of unease that settled deep in his chest. He moved through the rooms with a purposeful stride, gathering papers, making calls, and preparing for the storm he knew was coming. The evidence he had uncovered at City Hall lay scattered across the large wooden desk in his study, each document a piece of the puzzle he was slowly putting together. But it wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed someone who could move in the shadows, someone who understood the darker undercurrents that ran beneath Akra's surface. That someone was Kwame Okoro. Musa picked up the phone, his fingers pausing momentarily over the buttons as he considered what he was about to do. Kwame was more than just an old friend. He was a former police officer who had seen the worst of what people could do. But bringing him into this meant crossing a line, one that Musa wasn't sure he could ever come back from. He shook off the doubt and dialed the number, listening to the ringing tone with a tension that tightened his grip on the receiver. Okoro, the voice on the other end, was as familiar as it was gruff, a no-nonsense tone that carried the weight of years spent in the service of the law. "Kwame, it's Musa," he said, keeping his voice steady. I need to talk to you. It's important. There was a pause, a brief silence that told Musa everything he needed to know. Kwame was already putting the pieces together in his mind, already assessing the situation. All right, Kwame finally replied. Where and when? Tonight. My place. I'll explain everything when you get here. I'll be there in an hour. The line went dead and Musa set the phone down, the weight of his decision settling over him like a heavy coat. He walked over to the study's window and parted the curtains just enough to peer outside. The street was quiet, the rain from earlier leaving the pavement slick and reflective under the streetlights. But Musa knew better than to trust the calm. An hour later, the doorbell rang, its sound sharp and intrusive in the silence of the house. Musa opened the door to find Kwame standing there, his coat wet from the drizzle that had started up again, his eyes sharp and probing. Kwame greeted him with a nod, stepping inside and shedding his coat. What's this about? Musa led him to the study without a word, the tension between them thickening with every step. Once inside, Musa gestured to the desk where the documents lay in disarray. This, he said simply. Kwame moved closer, his eyes narrowing as he took in the papers, financial records, legal documents, complaints filed and ignored. He reached out, picking up a file and flipping through it with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too much corruption in his life. You've been busy, Kwame remarked, his voice neutral. Not busy enough, Musa replied, his tone carrying the weight of the past few days. Baobab Children's Home. It's not what it seems. Mamisa Kone. There's something dark happening there. I've found enough to be sure of that, but I need your help to dig deeper. Kwame closed the file and met Musa's gaze, his expression unreadable. You know what you're asking for, don't you? This isn't just some charity gone wrong. If what you're saying is true, we're dealing with something a lot more dangerous. I know, Musa said, the words coming out more resolutely than he felt. But those kids, Amma and Kojo, they've been through hell. I can't just walk away from this. Kwame studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. All right, Musa. I'll look into it quietly, but you need to be careful. Once you start pulling at these threads, you might not like what unravels. I'm prepared for that, Musa replied, though the unease gnawing at him suggested otherwise. Kwame gathered the files, slipping them into his coat pocket. I'll be in touch, he said, heading for the door. But before he left, he turned back to Musa, his expression softening slightly. You're doing the right thing. But it's not going to be easy. Watch your back. When the door closed behind him, the house fell into silence once more. Musa stood in the middle of his study, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. As he sat down at his desk, staring at the empty space where the files had been, he felt the full measure of what lay before him: the children's safety, the truth hidden within Baobab, the danger that came with challenging such powerful forces. Everything was now his burden to bear, and he had to see it through, no matter the cost. Musa moved through the streets of Accra with a growing sense of unease, the weight of what he was uncovering pressing down on him. The city, with its mix of old colonial charm and modern affluence, seemed to hold its breath as he delved deeper into the shadows. The rain-soaked streets reflected the dim glow of streetlights, and the world around him felt eerily detached, as though he were navigating a labyrinth of secrets hidden in plain sight. His first stop was a local bar on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where deals were made in whispers and loyalties were bought with a nod and a handshake. The bartender, a burly man with a gold chain glinting against his dark skin, eyed Musa suspiciously as he ordered a drink. But when Musa slid him a folded wad of CDs and asked about Mamisa Kone, the man's demeanor changed. She's got powerful friends, the bartender muttered, leaning in closer. Not someone you want to mess with, trust me. People who cross her, they don't stay around for long. Musa nodded, absorbing the information. It was as he suspected. Mamisa wasn't just running a corrupt orphanage, she was part of a much larger network that reached deep into the city's power structure. But he needed more than rumors. He needed proof. His investigation led him to a series of meetings in back rooms and dingy offices, where the smell of sweat and stale smoke lingered in the air. Each conversation painted a clearer picture of the web Mamisa had spun around herself. Local businessmen, politicians, and even law enforcement officials all had their hands dirty, all had a stake in keeping Baobab under the radar. The orphanage was a front, a means to an end for something far more sinister. As Musa pieced together the connections, his sense of dread deepened. The power Mamisa wielded wasn't just about influence, it was about fear. Those who opposed her found themselves at the mercy of a system designed to protect its own. And the children Ayama, Kojo, and countless others were caught in the crossfire, pawns in a game they couldn't even begin to understand. Late one night, Musa found himself in the office of a real estate developer known for his shady dealings. The man, slick and smooth-talking, had more to lose than he cared to admit. Under the pressure of Musa's questions, he let slip a detail that sent chills down Musa's spine. Mamisa had been moving children out of the country, placing them in homes with no oversight, using them as a commodity in a trade that was as dark as it was unthinkable. Musa left the meeting with a knot in his stomach, his mind racing. He had enough to confirm his worst fears, but it wasn't enough to bring Mamisa down. Not yet. He needed concrete evidence, paper trails, testimonies, anything that could expose the full extent of her operations. But as he walked through the quiet streets, Musa couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The darkness around him felt alive, the shadows too deep, the silence too heavy. Mamisa knew he was closing in, and she wouldn't let him get any closer without a fight. Back at his home, Musa sat in his study, staring at the scattered documents that lined his desk. His mind was racing, trying to figure out his next move. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like never before. He was used to high-stakes decisions in the business world, but this was different. This wasn't about profits or deals, this was about lives. Innocent lives that depended on him making the right call. Kwame was the first person he called. They needed to act quickly, but they had to be smart about it. Musa had seen enough corruption in his city to know that one wrong move could send Mamisa running, disappearing into the underworld, taking the children with her. When Kwame arrived, his face was set in a deep frown. "We need to be precise," he said, studying the map of Accra laid out on Musa's desk. "If we go in too early, we risk tipping her off. But if we wait too long, she'll move the children, and we'll lose our chance." Musa nodded, his expression grim. "We can't afford any mistakes," he replied. "These kids have already been through too much." The tension in the room was palpable as they went over their plan. They had gathered enough evidence to get the authorities involved, but they knew that wasn't going to be enough. Mamisa had friends in high places, and she could pull strings to escape justice if they weren't careful. Kwame insisted they needed to act fast but build their case meticulously, so she wouldn't have anywhere to hide once they struck. "We need to go through everything we have," Musa said, determination ringing in his voice. "There has to be something we've missed, something that'll give us the leverage we need to expose her." The hours passed in a tense silence, the only sounds coming from the rustle of papers and the occasional scratch of a pen. Musa's focus was intense, his mind searching through every detail, every clue, looking for the missing piece that could bring Mamisa down once and for all. Then the phone rang, breaking the silence like a thunderclap. Musa snatched it up, his heart racing in his chest. "Musa," he answered, his voice clipped. The voice on the other end was low and urgent. "I've got word that Mamisa is planning to move the kids tonight. There's a plane scheduled to leave the old airstrip outside the city at dawn." Musa's grip tightened on the phone, a sense of urgency flooding his veins. "We don't have much time." Kwame looked up, reading the alarm in Musa's eyes. "What is it?" Musa hung up the phone, his decision made. "She's moving them tonight. We need to act now." Kwame nodded, already grabbing his coat. "Let's make sure she doesn't get away with this." The night was thick with tension as Musa, Kwame, and a team of officers approached Baobab Children's home. The moon was hidden behind a thick veil of clouds, offering little light as they moved through the shadows toward the orphanage. The old building loomed before them, its high walls and barred windows giving it the look of a fortress. Musa's heart pounded in his chest, every step heavier than the last. This was it, the moment everything had been leading up to. There was no turning back now. Kwame signaled the team to stop just before they reached the side entrance. His voice was a barely audible whisper in the dark. "We move fast, we move quiet. No mistakes." Musa nodded, adjusting his grip on the flashlight. His breath steadied as he focused on the task ahead. They couldn't afford to fail now, not with the lives of so many children on the line. The team fanned out, slipping silently through the shadows. Musa and Kwame moved together toward the side door. One of the officers quickly worked on the lock, and after a few moments, the door clicked open. Inside, the air was thick with the musty smell of neglect. The orphanage was silent, its darkened corridors illuminated only by the faint glow of emergency lights. They moved swiftly through the building, turning corners with caution, opening doors with bated breath. Each step felt like a race against time. Every moment that passed was a moment closer to Mamisa escaping with the children. As they neared the main wing, the tension in the air thickened. This was where they would find Mamisa's office, where they hoped to find the evidence they needed, and where Mamisa herself might be waiting. Kwame looked at Musa and gave him a nod, the unspoken question clear. "Are you ready?" Musa steeled himself, pushing down the fear that threatened to rise. "Let's do this." The door to Mamisa's office creaked open and Musa stepped inside, his heart racing. The room was dimly lit by a single desk lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. Piles of papers were scattered across the desk, and in the corner, a safe stood slightly ajar. Musa's eyes quickly scanned the room, searching for any sign of Mamisa. But it was empty, save for the quiet hum of a ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead. Kwame motioned toward the desk. "We need to move fast. Look for anything we can use." Musa nodded and immediately began rifling through the papers. Receipts, financial reports, bank transfers, all of it pointed to the corrupt dealings that Mamisa had been hiding for years. He stuffed as many documents as he could into a folder. Kwame, meanwhile, kept his eyes on the door, listening for any sounds of movement in the hallway. Just as Musa reached for another stack of papers, they heard hurried footsteps approaching from the corridor. Kwame signaled Musa to get down, and the two men crouched behind the desk as the door swung open. Mamisa stood there, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. Her eyes scanned the room, suspicion written across her face. She was holding a phone to her ear, speaking quickly in Twi, her tone urgent. "They're getting too close," she hissed into the phone. "We need to move the children now." Musa's heart pounded as he listened to her. She hadn't seen them yet. Kwame's hand tightened around his gun, ready for whatever came next. As Mamisa turned her back to the room, still talking on her phone, Musa silently rose from behind the desk. In one swift motion, he grabbed her arm, twisting the phone out of her hand. Mamisa gasped, spinning around in shock. Her eyes flared with anger and panic as she realized who had caught her. "You," she spat, struggling to free herself from Musa's grip. "It's over," Musa said, his voice steady, though his pulse raced. "We know everything." Mamisa's face contorted with rage. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she snapped, her voice filled with venom. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing but an insect in this city. You can't fight the people who protect me." Kwame stepped forward, his face grim. "We'll see about that." Mamisa glared at them both, her confidence faltering as she realized the weight of the situation. Musa held her tightly, his resolve firm. "Where are the children?" he demanded, his voice cold. Mamisa's eyes darted toward the window, then back to Musa. "You're too late. They're already being moved." Before Musa could respond, there was a sudden crash from the hallway. The guards, alerted by the commotion, had arrived. Kwame spun around, gun drawn, and fired a warning shot into the ceiling, halting the guards in their tracks. "Stay back." Kwame barked, his voice echoing in the corridor. The guards hesitated, looking at one another, unsure of whether to advance. But it was too late for them to intervene. The police, having followed Musa and Kwame's trail, stormed the building from the front, overwhelming the remaining guards with sheer numbers. In a matter of minutes, the orphanage was under the control of law enforcement. Mamisa, realizing her empire was crumbling around her, sagged in Musa's grip. The fight had left her. Musa released her arm, and she slumped into the chair behind the desk, her eyes hollow. She knew the game was up. The officers quickly moved in, cuffing Mamisa as she stared blankly at the floor. Musa stood by, watching silently. He had won, but there was no sense of triumph. only a deep, aching relief. The dawn was beginning to break as Musa and Kwame stood outside Baobab Children's home, watching as the last of the children were safely escorted into waiting vehicles. Amma and Kojo were among them, their wide, tired eyes watching Musa from the back of a police van. He gave them a small, reassuring nod, and Amma finally relaxed, leaning her head against Kojo's shoulder. Musa's heart swelled with a fierce protectiveness. They were safe now. The nightmare was over. Kwame clapped a hand on Musa's shoulder, breaking the silence. "You did it, man. These kids, they've got a real chance now." Musa exhaled slowly, the weight of the past few days lifting off his shoulders. "We did it," he corrected, "and it's only the beginning. There's still a lot of work to do." Kwame nodded in agreement. "Yeah, but you've taken the hardest step. You've given these kids hope." Musa watched as the police vans began to drive away, carrying the children to a temporary shelter where they would be cared for. The city was slowly coming to life around them, the sounds of early morning traffic and the hum of daily life beginning to fill the air. But for Musa, the world felt different now. He had seen a part of his city that few dared to look at, a darkness that had been hiding in plain sight. And he knew he couldn't turn away from it. Weeks passed, and the trial of Mamisa Kone became the talk of Accra. The once untouchable director of Baobab Children's Home had been exposed as the head of a corrupt network that exploited children for profit. With the evidence Musa and Kwame had gathered, the prosecution's case was airtight. Mamisa was sentenced to life in prison, and her accomplices, many of whom were high-ranking officials and local businessmen, faced similar fates. Musa attended the sentencing, watching as Mamisa was led away in handcuffs. The woman who had once held so much power now looked broken, her head bowed in defeat. There was no satisfaction in seeing her like this, only a quiet sense of justice. The children she had harmed would never forget what they had been through, but they would no longer live in fear. After the trial, Musa returned to his home, where Amma and Kojo had been staying since the raid on the orphanage. The adoption process had begun, and though it was long and complicated, Musa knew it was worth every moment of effort. He had already made up his mind these children were his now. They were family. As Musa entered the house, the sound of laughter greeted him. Amma and Kojo were playing in the front yard, chasing each other around a small garden Musa had planted with their help. The sun was shining brightly, casting long shadows across the ground, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of hibiscus flowers. "Dad," Amma called out as she ran toward him, her face beaming with joy. Musa knelt down, scooping her up into a hug, feeling the warmth of her small body against his. Kojo toddled over, giggling as he wrapped his arms around Musa's leg. Musa's heart swelled with a deep, overwhelming sense of love. For the first time in years, the emptiness inside him was gone. "You're home early," Amma said, her eyes bright with excitement. Musa smiled. "I couldn't stay away any longer," he said, ruffling her hair. "I missed you too." Amma grinned, and Kojo looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. Musa's heart ached with happiness. He had found something far more valuable than success or wealth. He had found a purpose. As the sun began to set over Accra, Musa stood on the porch of his home, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. Ayama and Kojo were inside, fast asleep after a day filled with play and laughter. The house, once a place of solitude and emptiness, was now filled with the warmth of family. Musa reflected on everything that had happened, the journey he had taken, the lives he had touched, and the future that lay ahead. There would be challenges, of course, but he was ready for them. He had something to fight for now. A family, a cause, and a city that needed change. In the distance, the sounds of the city hummed, vibrant and alive. Musa smiled to himself, knowing that the future, though uncertain, held endless possibilities. For him, Amma, Kojo, and the many other children who had been given a second chance, the fight was far from over. But tonight, as the cool evening breeze brushed against his face, Musa Kamara felt a deep sense of peace. The darkness had been driven away, and in its place, there was hope. And that, he knew, was worth everything. The moral of the story is one of compassion, responsibility, and justice. It teaches us that true success is not measured by wealth or power, but by the impact we have on the lives of others, especially the vulnerable. Musa Kamara, despite having all the material success one could want, found his true purpose in caring for Ayama and Kojo, two innocent children caught in a web of corruption and suffering. His journey shows that even in a world filled with darkness and corruption, there is always hope if we have the courage to stand up for what is right. In this story, Musa's decision to help the children not only saved their lives, but also brought a corrupt system to justice. It reminds us that we have a responsibility to protect the weak and stand up against injustice, even when the path is difficult. We can conclude with a prayer to Allah, asking for strength and guidance in always choosing the path of compassion and justice. Ya Allah, grant us the strength and courage to stand up for those who are oppressed and vulnerable. Help us be a source of mercy and compassion, as you are the most merciful. Guide us to always act with righteousness. And protect us from the evils of corruption and injustice. Bless us with the wisdom to make a positive impact in this world and grant peace to those who are suffering. Amin.